The late afternoon sun spilled through the glass doors of the courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Anthony Reed, a sharp, composed black attorney in his early 40s, strode through the hallway with quiet confidence. He had just won a small but important case, a tenant unfairly evicted by a wealthy landlord. Anthony was known for his meticulous work and unwavering calm, but as he stepped toward the exit, his path was blocked by Officer Kane, a towering figure in uniform, his presence heavy with arrogance. "Hold on," Kane said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "You! What are you doing here?" Anthony raised an eyebrow, keeping his tone even. "I just finished a hearing. I'm heading out." Kane smirked. "Sure you are. Let me see your ID." Anthony paused. "Excuse me?" "I said," Kane repeated, stepping closer, "show me your ID. People like you don't just walk around this courthouse unless they're here for other reasons." Several people waiting nearby glanced over. A clerk stopped filing papers, sensing the tension. Anthony stayed calm. "Officer, I'm an attorney. My bar card and clearance are on file with security. You can check them if you like." But Kane ignored the explanation. His tone sharpened, echoing through the hallway. "I don't care what you say you are. Around here, I decide who belongs. And you? You don't look like you belong." A quiet murmur rippled through the hallway. Someone discreetly pulled out a phone, recording the scene. Anthony exhaled slowly. "I don't appreciate your implication, nor the disrespect. You're overstepping your authority." Kane chuckled coldly. "Oh, I'm overstepping. Let me explain something. You think your fancy suit makes you better than me? I can have you detained right now for obstructing a security check." Anthony stood his ground. "And I can have you reported for harassment. I know my rights." That response seemed to enrage Kane further. His voice grew louder. "You think your law degree means something here? You people always think the rules don't apply to you. Maybe a night in holding would remind you where you actually stand." Gasps echoed from the onlookers. The woman recording zoomed in on Kane's furious face. Anthony's voice remained calm but firm. "I'm warning you. Continue down this path, and you'll regret it. I've dealt with officers like you before. It never ends well for them." Kane smirked menacingly. "Is that a threat?" "No," Anthony replied evenly. "It's a fact." Before Kane could respond, a voice cut through the hallway, calm, clear, and unmistakably authoritative. "Officer Kane, step away from him, now." Everyone turned. Standing at the end of the hallway was Chief Prosecutor Linda Vasquez, flanked by two courthouse administrators. She strode forward, her heels clicking sharply, her eyes locked on Kane. Her expression was unreadable, but cold enough to make Kane shift uncomfortably. "Would you like to explain," Linda said slowly, "why you're harassing one of this courthouse's most respected attorneys in front of witnesses?" The entire hallway froze. All eyes turned to Chief Prosecutor Linda Vasquez as she approached with quiet but undeniable authority. Her presence alone was enough to silence the whispers. Kane straightened, his arrogant smirk faltering. "Chief Prosecutor, I was just doing a routine security check." Linda's eyes narrowed. "A routine security check? By threatening to detain an attorney who's been practicing here for over a decade?" She gestured toward Anthony without taking her eyes off Kane. "Mr. Reed doesn't need to justify his presence in this building. He belongs here more than you do right now." Anthony remained calm, his gaze steady as he watched the exchange. Kane tried to recover his composure. "With all due respect, ma'am, I saw him loitering near the exit and thought it was suspicious." Linda tilted her head slightly, her tone sharp as a blade. "Suspicious? For carrying a briefcase? For wearing a suit? or for simply existing in a space you decided he didn't belong in. The crowd of onlookers grew bolder. Phones were now openly recording. A clerk whispered to another, "She's going to bury him for this." Kane shifted uncomfortably, his voice defensive. "I was just doing my job." "No," Linda cut him off, her voice low but lethal. "Your job is to ensure the safety of this courthouse, not to harass and intimidate officers of the court, or anyone else for that matter. And I find it very interesting that this isn't the first time I've heard whispers about your conduct." That made Kane pause. "Whispers?" Linda's gaze hardened. "Yes, Officer Kane. Whispers about your extracurricular dealings, about the way you treat certain people in this building, about how cases seem to go missing when you're involved." A murmur rippled through the hallway. Anthony's eyes narrowed slightly, realizing there was more to this confrontation than simple bias. Kane's voice wavered for the first time. "I don't know what you're talking about." Linda smirked faintly, but it wasn't a smile of humor. It was the kind of smile a predator gives when it knows the prey has nowhere left to run. "Oh, you will. Because as of this morning, an internal investigation into your conduct is officially open. And this little performance you just gave in front of half the courthouse?" She glanced at the raised phones. "It's more evidence to add to the pile." Anthony raised an eyebrow. "Investigation?" Linda glanced briefly at him. "Yes, we've been reviewing a pattern of complaints. Officer Kane here has a history of targeting individuals, attorneys, defendants, even visitors, based on personal bias, and he's not very careful about covering his tracks." Kane took a step back. "This is ridiculous. I've done nothing wrong." Linda stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough for him to hear, though the tension in the hallway made everyone lean in. "We already found the missing case files you thought no one would notice. We've already spoken to the witnesses who saw you take bribes to lose evidence for certain defendants. And now, after this little stunt, you've given us one more reason to suspend you immediately." The crowd gasped audibly. Anthony stayed silent, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp. Kane's face drained of color. You have no proof of that." Linda straightened, her calm composure returning. "We have more proof than you can handle. And when the Chief Justice hears about what happened today, you'll be lucky if suspension is the only thing you face." She turned to the bailiff standing nearby. "Escort Officer Kane out of this building. Effective immediately, he is relieved of duty pending a full investigation." The bailiff nodded and stepped forward. Kane looked around frantically, his bravado completely gone. "You can't do this. I've worked here for years." Linda's voice was cold and final. "Exactly. And for years, you've treated this courthouse like it was your personal domain. That ends today." As the bailiff led Kane away, the hallway erupted in whispers. Phones recorded the entire scene, already preparing to flood social media with the latest revelation. Linda turned to Anthony, her tone softening. "I'm sorry you were subjected to that. Unfortunately, you're not the first." Anthony nodded calmly. "I suspected as much, but it looks like his mask finally slipped." Linda gave a small, knowing smile. "Oh, Mr. Reed, his mask didn't just slip. It's about to come off entirely." By the next morning, the courthouse confrontation had already gone viral. Clips of Officer Kane threatening Anthony, followed by Chief Prosecutor Linda Vasquez calmly dismantling him, spread across social media with millions of views. Headlines flooded every platform. Officer suspended after harassing black lawyer, exposed as corrupt. Chief prosecutor shuts down racist threat in courthouse. People were outraged, but they were also curious. What had Linda meant about missing case files and bribes? Inside her office, Linda reviewed a thick folder of evidence with her investigative team. For months, quiet complaints had been piling up. Whispers of Kane losing key documents, intimidating witnesses, and receiving suspicious cash deposits. Until now, there hadn't been enough to act decisively. But after his very public outburst toward Anthony, Linda knew the timing was perfect to bring it all into the light. "We've connected him to at least 6 tampered cases," one investigator said. Laying out photos and financial records, it looks like he was being paid by a defense attorney with shady connections to make evidence disappear. Linda nodded. "And now, thanks to his little display yesterday, we have both a motive and a public reason to escalate this." Meanwhile, Anthony sat in his office, still processing the events. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. Calls from colleagues offering support, reporters requesting statements, and even clients thanking him for standing firm. Elaine, his paralegal, walked in holding a stack of emails. "Anthony, you've been invited to speak at 2 legal forums already. They want you to talk about bias in the courthouse system." Anthony sighed. "I didn't want to become a symbol. I just wanted to do my job." Elaine smiled gently. "Sometimes doing your job is exactly what exposes the truth." Later that afternoon, Linda called Anthony directly. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I want you to know the investigation into Kane's activities is moving quickly. We'll likely need your testimony, not just about what happened yesterday, but any interactions you've had with him before." Anthony thought back. "I've seen him linger near my hearings before. He made comments under his breath. Small things I ignored. I assumed it wasn't worth the fight." Linda's voice was calm but firm. "This time, it is worth it. We're about to show the entire city who he really is." Meanwhile, at the precinct, Kane was being questioned by internal affairs. He sat stiffly in a cold interrogation room, sweat gathering at his temples. "You were recorded threatening an attorney," the investigator said flatly. "You were caught mishandling evidence, and we've traced multiple cash deposits into your account that match dates of dismissed cases. Do you want to explain that?" Kane's voice cracked. "You're twisting this. I was just following orders." "Whose orders?" the investigator pressed. Kane hesitated, realizing he was cornered. By the evening, more layers of his corruption began leaking to the press. News outlets revealed he had ties to a private security firm with a history of questionable dealings. Former courthouse staff came forward anonymously, describing years of intimidation and unethical behavior. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "No one above the law." Community activists demanded a full audit of Kane's past cases, fearing how many lives had been damaged by his misconduct. Linda held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as she addressed the public with measured clarity. "Officer Kane's behavior yesterday was unacceptable, but it was only the tip of the iceberg. We are uncovering a pattern of corruption, intimidation, and misconduct spanning years. This office will not rest until every compromised case is reviewed and every victim is heard." Anthony watched the press conference from his office, a mixture of relief and anger in his chest. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone Kane had silenced or harmed. Elaine looked at him. "Are you ready to testify?" Anthony nodded slowly. "Yes." It's time the truth is heard. And miles away, Kane sat alone in a dingy motel room, knowing the walls were closing in. His power, once unquestioned, was crumbling piece by piece. Because when corruption hides in the dark for too long, one spark of truth is enough to burn it all down. Within days, the investigation into Officer Kane deepened. The courthouse that had once been his personal domain now buzzed with whispers of his downfall. More people came forward, clerks, lawyers, even former defendants, sharing stories of intimidation, missing paperwork, and suspicious errors that always seemed to benefit certain wealthy clients. The media covered every detail relentlessly. Headlines screamed, "Officer Kane's web of corruption unravels. Dozens of cases under review." Victims of harassment in courthouse speak out. Linda Vasquez worked around the clock, leading the task force. Her team pulled files from the past decade, combing through every case Kane had touched. Patterns emerged. Evidence conveniently lost, key witnesses intimidated, and in some cases, charges mysteriously dropped after undisclosed payments changed hands. In a meeting with her investigators, Linda reviewed the mounting evidence. "We now have sworn statements from 4 different attorneys," one investigator said, handing her a folder. They all describe Kane targeting minority lawyers and their clients while protecting certain powerful defendants. Linda nodded grimly. "And Anthony Reed? He's agreed to testify," the investigator replied. "He's prepared to go on record about what happened to him, and he's willing to speak about the broader pattern." Meanwhile, Anthony's office had become a hub for reporters and community advocates. Though he had never sought attention, his calm composure during the incident made him a trusted voice. In a small press interview, Anthony spoke plainly. "This isn't about me," he said. "This is about a system that allowed someone like Kane to operate unchecked for years. It's about every case he tainted and every person who felt silenced because they didn't have the power to fight back." That ends now. The interview went viral, amplifying the growing outrage. Community leaders organized forums where victims shared their experiences. One elderly woman tearfully recounted how her grandson's case had been dismissed unfairly after Kane misplaced crucial evidence. Another young attorney revealed how Kane had threatened to make her career difficult if she didn't drop a case. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs demanding justice. "Review every case," one banner read. "Corruption ends here," said another. At the precinct, Kane's world collapsed further. Internal Affairs presented him with undeniable proof: bank records, surveillance footage, and testimony from former accomplices. "You're done," the lead investigator said coldly. "You can cooperate and tell us everything, or you can watch this all play out in court." Kane's shoulders slumped. For the first time, his defiance cracked. "You don't understand," he muttered. "It wasn't just me. There are bigger players. I was just keeping the wheels turning." But no one cared for his excuses anymore. Later that week, Linda held another press conference, this time flanked by Anthony Reed. Cameras flashed as she spoke. "We have confirmed a network of corruption that reached into multiple cases," Linda announced. "Officer Kane will face charges for harassment, evidence tampering, and bribery. Additionally, over 30 cases he influenced are being reopened and reviewed for fairness." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Reporters turned to Anthony for comment. "I stood my ground in a single moment," Anthony said. But this isn't about one moment anymore. It's about making sure no one ever feels powerless in a place meant for justice. We will not stop until the damage he caused is undone. Across the city, law schools and community groups held forums inspired by Anthony's courage. Young lawyers began volunteering to review old cases, determined to restore the lives that had been harmed. Meanwhile, Kane was escorted into a holding cell, his badge stripped away. For the first time in years, he was the one facing the system he once manipulated. And miles away, in a community center filled with people, Anthony looked out at the crowd and saw hope, not just for accountability, but for a new culture of transparency and respect. Because one man's arrogance had been exposed, and the truth was now unstoppable. As the investigation expanded, the web of Kane's corruption unraveled like a tangled thread. It turned out he wasn't working alone. Court records revealed a troubling connection between Kane and a handful of influential defense attorneys who had quietly paid him to lose key evidence or intimidate witnesses. News stations aired nightly updates. Corruption ring in courthouse larger than expected. Multiple suspects under scrutiny. Community demands full audit of past cases. Linda Vasquez's office became the nerve center of the operation. Her team worked around the clock, pulling decades of case files and interviewing anyone who had crossed paths with Kane. One evening, in a strategy meeting, Linda pointed to a whiteboard filled with names and timelines. Kane was the face, but he wasn't the mastermind, she said firmly. He was the enforcer. We need to follow the money to the people who enabled him. An investigator slid a folder across the table. We've traced payments from a private legal fund connected to a high-profile law firm. That's where the bribes came from. Linda's jaw tightened. Good. That means this doesn't stop with Kane. It goes all the way to the top. Meanwhile, Anthony's role shifted from silent victim to key witness. He worked closely with Linda's team, identifying patterns of harassment and corroborating testimonies from other attorneys who had been too afraid to speak before. At a televised community forum, Anthony addressed a packed auditorium. What happened to me was public, but many others faced the same intimidation quietly, without cameras to protect them, he said. This is bigger than one officer. It's about a culture that let him thrive. And that culture ends now. The crowd erupted in applause. Victims who once felt voiceless began coming forward, emboldened by Anthony's calm courage. Stories poured in. Families whose cases had been derailed. Small businesses ruined by lost evidence. Defendants who never got a fair hearing. Outside the courthouse, protests turned into organized rallies calling for sweeping reforms. Signs read, "Justice for every case," and "Clean the system now." Law students volunteered to review compromised cases, forming task forces to restore what Kane's corruption had destroyed. At the precinct, Kane sat in an interrogation room, surrounded by evidence of his wrongdoing. Bank records, emails, even voice recordings from his co-conspirators. "You're not walking out of this," the investigator told him flatly. "Your partners are already talking. It's over." Kane stared at the table, his once defiant demeanor gone. He muttered, "You don't understand how deep this goes." "Then you'd better start explaining," the investigator replied. Meanwhile, Linda held another press briefing outside the courthouse. Cameras clicked as she spoke, flanked by Anthony and several other attorneys who had come forward. We are officially reopening 43 cases that were tainted by Officer Kane's actions, Linda announced. Multiple accomplices are being charged, and this office will ensure every victim of this corruption is heard. A reporter asked, "Will more people face justice beyond Kane?" Linda nodded. "Yes, this investigation is far from over. Anyone who profited from this network will be held accountable." Anthony then stepped up to the microphones. "This isn't just about exposing what was wrong," he said. "It's about rebuilding trust in a system that was meant to serve the people. We can't erase the harm that was done, but we can make sure it never happens again." The crowd cheered, some chanting Anthony's name, others shouting for justice. Later that evening, Anthony returned home, exhausted but resolute. Elaine handed him a letter left at the office. It was from a young law student who had seen his story. "I want to become a lawyer because of you. You showed me that even in the face of hate, standing with dignity can change everything." Anthony read it quietly, feeling a mix of humility and determination. Because what started as a moment of humiliation had become the spark for a reckoning that would change the courthouse forever. And miles away, Kane sat in a holding cell, realizing that the power he once wielded was gone, replaced by the weight of every life he had harmed. Because when the truth begins to surface, it doesn't stop until every shadow is exposed. The courthouse investigation exploded into a full-scale scandal. What began as one officer's misconduct now revealed a network of corruption that reached deeper than anyone imagined. News anchors reported daily updates. High-profile attorneys linked to courthouse bribery scheme. Dozens of cases under review as corruption probe expands. Linda Vasquez held nightly meetings with her task force. Stacks of documents covered her office. Bank statements, emails, and recorded testimonies connecting Kane's actions to a circle of powerful lawyers who had been manipulating the system for years. This wasn't just a rogue officer, Linda told her team. This was an organized operation. Kane intimidated the weak, protected the powerful, and got paid to do it. But we're taking every single one of them down. Meanwhile, Anthony Reed was drawn deeper into the investigation. His testimony about Kane's public harassment became a cornerstone of the case. But he also worked behind the scenes, helping review cases that had been unfairly dismissed. In one reopened case, Anthony discovered a family who had lost their home because Kane had misplaced crucial evidence. Sitting with them in a small community center, he explained how the investigation was giving them a second chance. "Because you're willing to speak up now," the mother said softly, "my children might finally get justice." "Thank you." Anthony smiled gently. "This isn't just my fight anymore. It's everyone's fight." Outside the courthouse, the protests evolved into community forums where people shared their stories and demanded long-term reforms. Law students volunteered to help attorneys comb through old cases. Retired judges offered free guidance to families whose lives had been upended by Kane's corruption. The media uncovered even more damning evidence. Recordings of Kane accepting bribes from a prominent defense lawyer, emails where he promised to make problems disappear, and surveillance footage of him escorting key witnesses out of hearings under false pretenses. At the precinct, Kane was confronted with all of it. Sitting in a stark interrogation room, his former allies turning against him one by one, he finally broke. "Fine," Kane muttered, his voice hollow. You want names? I'll give you names. I wasn't the only one getting paid. The lawyers, the clerks, even a few judges, they were all in on it. The investigator leaned forward. Then start talking. Within days, arrest warrants were issued for several high-profile attorneys and one retired judge. The city watched in shock as respected figures were led out of their offices in handcuffs. Linda held a major press conference on the courthouse steps, flanked by Anthony and other attorneys who had helped uncover the scheme. Cameras flashed as she spoke. We have dismantled a network of corruption that undermined justice in this city for years. Over 50 cases are being reopened. Those who abused their power will face the same system they tried to manipulate. Today is a turning point. Anthony then stepped forward. This courthouse belongs to the people, he said, his voice calm but steady. And it should never again be a place where bias and corruption decide who wins or loses. We can't change the past, but we can build a future where the law truly protects everyone. The crowd erupted in applause. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes, watching from home, smiled faintly. He sent Anthony a message of support. One act of courage can expose an entire empire of lies. Keep going. That evening, Anthony returned to his office to find letters piled on his desk. Thank you notes from families whose cases were being reopened. From young law students inspired by his composure. From ordinary citizens grateful for his stand. Elaine looked through them with him. It feels like you're finally making the system what it was meant to be, she said softly. Anthony nodded. It's not just me. It's everyone who decided enough was enough. And miles away, Kane sat in a jail cell awaiting trial, realizing that the empire he thought would protect him had crumbled, leaving him exposed and forgotten. Because once the truth starts pulling threads, the entire web unravels. The courthouse scandal reached its peak within weeks. What began as whispers turned into full-blown revelations of a systemic corruption network. Major news outlets ran constant coverage, showing images of high-profile lawyers and even a retired judge being escorted in handcuffs. Linda Vasquez stood at the center of it all, orchestrating the investigation with unwavering precision. Her office now resembled a war room, walls lined with case files, timelines, and financial charts linking everyone involved. Here's the latest, one investigator said during a late-night briefing. Kane's testimony has led us to a money laundering ring connected to the legal fund of two major firms. They've been funneling bribe money through shell accounts for years. Linda nodded, her face set in determination. Good. That means this doesn't stop with Kane. It stretches across the entire courthouse system. Keep digging. We're going to uproot it all. Meanwhile, Anthony Reed had become the face of integrity in the media. Though he never sought the spotlight, his calm, measured statements resonated deeply with the public. He was invited to speak at community forums, law schools, and even legislative hearings about court reform. One evening, at a packed town hall, Anthony addressed the crowd. This isn't about tearing down a courthouse, he said, his voice steady. It's about rebuilding it into what it should have always been, a place where justice is blind, not biased. We can't undo the harm, but we can make sure it never happens again. The audience gave him a standing ovation. Across the city, community initiatives were springing up. Volunteer legal clinics formed to help families whose cases were compromised. Law students joined attorneys to review dismissed files, offering pro bono support to anyone affected by the corruption. Jonathan Hayes, now a recognized advocate for ethical reform, partnered with Anthony to create a safe justice project, modeled after his successful Safe Spaces initiative. It provided oversight tools for courthouses, ensuring no single officer or attorney could manipulate the system again. At the same time, the political landscape shifted. Lawmakers, pressured by the public, proposed sweeping judicial integrity laws, mandatory audits of court staff, stricter oversight for officers, and digital tracking for evidence management. Inside the jail, Kane watched the news on a small TV. His name was mentioned alongside a list of disgraced officials who had already accepted plea deals. He buried his face in his hands, finally understanding that there was no escape from the fallout. The very system he once bent to his will had turned against him. Back at the courthouse, a small but powerful moment unfolded. Linda and Anthony walked through the now reformed security checkpoint. Officers greeted visitors respectfully, and a new plaque hung on the wall. This courthouse belongs to the people. All who enter here deserve dignity. Linda glanced at Anthony. "It's different now," she said quietly. Anthony nodded. "It feels lighter, like the air isn't filled with fear anymore." Later that week, Linda held a final press conference announcing the end of the initial investigation. "We have officially charged 12 individuals connected to this corruption ring. 49 cases have been reopened, and reforms are already in place to prevent this from happening again. Justice isn't just a word, it's an action, and today we've taken that action." Anthony stood beside her, offering his final statement. "This was never just about me. It was about every person who walked into this courthouse and felt powerless. Together we've proven that the truth can't be silenced, not forever." The crowd erupted in cheers. That evening, Anthony returned to his office. Waiting on his desk was a simple letter from a young law student. "Because of your courage, I believe the law can still serve the people. I'm entering law school this fall to follow in your footsteps." Anthony smiled faintly, feeling a quiet sense of hope. Because what started as a single act of arrogance had ignited a movement of accountability and integrity that no one could stop. And miles away, Kane sat in his cell, realizing that his power was gone, and in its place was a legacy of justice he could never undo. The courthouse scandal had now evolved into a statewide movement. What started with one officer's abuse of power was sparking reforms in every corner of the judicial system. Community groups, inspired by the exposure of Kane's network, demanded similar audits in other counties. The governor announced a statewide initiative to review all courthouse staff and policies, promising transparency where there had once been silence. At a televised press event, the governor stated, "Thanks to the bravery of those who spoke up, including attorney Anthony Reed and Chief Prosecutor Linda Vasquez, we now know the cracks in our system. Today, we begin filling them, not with excuses, but with accountability." Applause filled the room, but Anthony remained quietly humble. He didn't see himself as a hero, just someone who refused to bow to intimidation. Meanwhile, Linda's office continued to reopen compromised cases. She met daily with families whose lives had been upended by Kane's corruption. Some cried with relief knowing they'd finally get their day in court. Others simply thanked her and Anthony for not letting the truth be buried. One afternoon, Linda and Anthony sat in a meeting reviewing the latest list of reopened cases. 49 reopened, Linda said, tapping the folder, and counting. We're giving people their lives back piece by piece. Anthony nodded. It's slow, but it's necessary. Every one of these names matters. Outside the courthouse, the Safe Justice Project that Anthony and Jonathan Hayes had launched was gaining traction. Courthouses in neighboring states requested consultations to implement oversight systems, community feedback channels, and ethics training. Jonathan, ever the calm strategist, told a room full of courthouse administrators, "You don't wait for a scandal to build trust. You build it every single day by treating people with dignity. If you can't promise that, you shouldn't be in this business." Meanwhile, the public's trust began to slowly rebuild. Where there had once been protests and anger, there were now community dialogues, town halls, and active collaborations between citizens and officials. At the same time, the personal fallout for Kane deepened. His trial date was set, and prosecutors prepared a mountain of evidence: testimonies from fellow officers, records of illicit payments, and dozens of victim statements. He spent his days in a holding cell, staring at the same four walls, knowing the empire he built on fear and corruption had turned to dust. The media coverage shifted focus. Instead of only highlighting the scandal, they began celebrating the reforms. News anchors talked about Anthony Reed's role in inspiring courage, about Linda Vasquez's uncompromising investigation, and about the countless citizens who came together to fix a broken system. Anthony was invited to speak at a statewide legal ethics summit where hundreds of judges, lawyers, and law students attended. Standing before the crowd, he said, "I didn't set out to change the system. I only wanted to be treated with the respect every citizen deserves. But that's how change begins, with one moment where you refuse to look away, even when it's easier to stay silent. That's what all of us must keep doing, together." The audience gave a standing ovation. After the summit, a young boy approached him shyly. "Mr. Reed," the boy said, "my mom told me you stood up to someone scary. I want to be brave like you." Anthony smiled, crouching to meet his eyes. "You already are brave. Never forget that." That evening, Anthony returned home. Elaine was waiting with a warm smile and a quiet dinner. She placed a letter on the table, a handwritten note from one of the reopened case families. "Because of you, my brother finally got his day in court. Thank you for not letting his voice be silenced." Anthony held the letter for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Because this was no longer about one man or one case. It was about the ripple effect of truth, reaching farther than he ever imagined. And somewhere, far removed from the light of progress, Kane sat in silence, a broken reminder of how easily power can destroy when left unchecked. Because when truth ignites, it doesn't just reveal darkness, it replaces it with hope. Months later, the wave of reforms that began with Kane's exposure had reached far beyond the city. Courthouses in neighboring states started requesting guidance from the Safe Justice Project, eager to implement their own oversight systems. What had once been a local scandal was now shaping national conversations about transparency and accountability in the justice system. At a regional summit, Linda Vasquez presented the outcomes of the investigation. 49 compromised cases reopened, she said, addressing a packed auditorium. 12 officials charged, 3 law firms dismantled, and most importantly, a courthouse culture transformed from fear to fairness. But this isn't an ending. It's the beginning of a new standard for every courthouse in this state. Anthony sat quietly in the front row, listening to the applause that followed. He still struggled to see himself as anything more than a man who refused to be silenced in one critical moment. But as he looked around at the faces of law students, judges, and community leaders, he began to understand the larger impact of that choice. After the summit, a young law clerk approached him. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, "I used to think the system couldn't change. But when I saw what you did and what followed, it made me believe again. I am staying in this field because of you." Anthony smiled gently. "Then that's worth everything." Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes was busy expanding safe justice beyond the courthouse walls. He partnered with community centers and schools, creating workshops on civic responsibility and ethical leadership. In a live interview, he reflected on the journey. "I didn't set out to change the world," Jonathan said, "but when you stand up in the moment that matters, you give others permission to do the same." Anthony Reed showed us all that courage can be quiet yet unstoppable. Back in the city, the reopened cases brought closure to many families. A father wrongfully accused because of missing evidence finally had his name cleared. A small business owner, ruined by Kane's lost documents, received compensation and a public apology. Each restored life became another piece of healing for the community. Anthony began visiting the families whose cases had been reopened. He didn't make speeches, he just listened. At one home, an elderly woman held his hands tightly. "My grandson spent years with a record that wasn't his fault," she said, tears in her eyes. "Because you didn't back down, he's free. Thank you." Anthony nodded quietly, humbled. Meanwhile, Kane's trial began. The courtroom that had once been his territory was now filled with reporters, lawyers, and the very people he had wronged. Evidence was laid out piece by piece: bank records, bribery notes, testimonies from former accomplices. His defense team looked overwhelmed, knowing there was no way to escape the mountain of proof. From his seat, Anthony watched Kane sit silently, no longer the arrogant figure who had once threatened him. Now, he was just another defendant facing the law he had betrayed. Linda delivered the closing argument with precision. This man used his badge to intimidate the innocent, to protect the guilty, and to undermine the very foundation of justice. Today, the system he corrupted will finally hold him accountable. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict: guilty on all counts. When the news broke, the city erupted in cautious celebration. It wasn't just about Kane's conviction. It was about knowing the truth had prevailed. Later that evening, Anthony returned to his office to find yet another letter waiting. "Because of your courage, I know the law can still serve the people. I'm starting law school next year. Thank you for showing me that justice can still mean something." He placed the letter on his desk beside the others, a growing stack of reminders that even a single moment of defiance could inspire countless acts of change. Because what began as one man's abuse of power had been turned into a powerful lesson. When you shine a light on injustice, it can't hide for long. And miles away, Kane sat in a prison cell, finally stripped of the authority he had abused for so long, left only with the silence of his own downfall. Kane's conviction sent shockwaves far beyond the city. It wasn't just a local scandal anymore. It became a national case study on how corruption could rot the justice system from the inside. News programs across the country covered the story, showing footage of the courthouse where it all began and replaying the moment Anthony Reed stood his ground with quiet dignity. The aftermath brought a wave of change. Lawmakers proposed a Judicial Integrity Reform Act modeled after the very policies Linda Vasquez had implemented during the investigation. The bill called for mandatory oversight committees in all courthouses, digital evidence tracking, and independent review boards to handle complaints against officers and staff. At the state capitol, Linda and Anthony were invited to testify before a legislative committee. "We can't undo the harm," Linda told the lawmakers, her voice calm but firm. "But we can build safeguards so that no single person has the unchecked power to destroy lives ever again." Anthony followed, addressing the room with quiet conviction. "I was threatened in a courthouse, a place meant to uphold the law. If it can happen to a lawyer, imagine what it feels like for someone with no resources, no voice. This isn't just about fixing policies. It's about restoring trust in a system that belongs to the people." The room erupted in applause. The bill passed unanimously. Meanwhile, the Safe Justice Project expanded beyond state lines, helping other cities audit their courthouses and train staff. Jonathan Hayes, speaking at a national conference, said, "We learned the hard way that silence allows corruption to thrive. Now, we're making sure every courthouse in this country is a place where dignity isn't optional. It's guaranteed." Back in their city, life began to feel lighter. Families whose cases were reopened started seeing justice served. The courthouse halls, once filled with fear and tension, were now filled with respect and calm order. Visitors were treated with dignity, staff were trained in empathy, and officers were reminded daily that their duty was to protect, not intimidate. Anthony found himself mentoring young attorneys who wanted to follow his example. One evening, at a small workshop for law students, he told them, "Justice isn't about winning every case. It's about making sure the system serves everyone fairly. Sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to stay silent. Be that person." Afterward, a student approached him. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I used to doubt the law could ever be fair. But your story showed me that it can be if people like us keep fighting for it. I want to work with you when I graduate." Anthony smiled warmly. "You won't be working for me. You'll be working for the people who need you most. That's where the real fight is." Meanwhile, in a prison cell miles away, Kane lived in quiet disgrace. His name was now only mentioned in law textbooks and training manuals as an example of what happens when power is abused. He watched the news occasionally, seeing Anthony and Linda celebrated for reforms, and each time he turned off the TV, unable to face what his actions had created. Later that year, the city held a justice renewal ceremony outside the courthouse. A new monument was unveiled, an elegant sculpture of an open book with light streaming from its pages. Inscribed on the base were the words, "Justice belongs to all. Truth protects us. Courage transforms us." As the crowd gathered, Linda spoke briefly. This courthouse was once a place of fear for some. Today, it stands as a place of hope for everyone. Anthony stood beside her, saying only, "The fight for dignity never ends." But today, we can stand proud knowing we made it stronger for the next generation. The crowd erupted in applause. Children holding candles and flowers around the new monument. Because what began as a single moment of intimidation had become a catalyst for nationwide change. A reminder that even in the darkest corners of power, the truth could still find its way to the light. And while Kane's name faded into infamy, the legacy of that truth grew brighter with each passing day. Months after the Justice Renewal Ceremony, the city's courthouse stood as a symbol of restored trust. The halls, once filled with whispers of fear and intimidation, now reflected a calm order. Officers treated visitors with respect, and the Independent Oversight Committee actively reviewed complaints. People began to believe again that justice could truly belong to everyone. The reforms didn't stop at the city. The Judicial Integrity Reform Act passed at the federal level, inspired directly by Linda Vasquez's investigation. Across the country, new policies were implemented: mandatory audits of court officers, real-time tracking of case files, and clear channels for citizens to report misconduct without retaliation. Anthony Reed, though still humble, had become a respected voice in the legal community. He was invited to speak at law schools and national ethics conferences. At one such conference, he stood before a room filled with young lawyers. "I never planned to be here," he began. "I was just a man doing his job when someone decided to abuse their power. But in that moment, I realized staying silent would only feed the system that allowed it. The truth doesn't shout, it stands firm. And when it stands, others will join it." The room erupted in applause, and many students left with renewed determination to fight for integrity in the law. Meanwhile, Linda Vasquez transitioned from Chief Prosecutor to a State Ethics Commissioner, overseeing judicial reforms on a much larger scale. She credited Anthony publicly whenever asked about her work. He didn't just refuse to back down. He showed us all what quiet strength looks like. Without him, the corruption might have stayed hidden even longer, she told reporters. Back in the city, the Safe Justice Project continued to thrive under Jonathan Hayes's guidance. Courthouses in multiple states adopted its model, turning it into a national standard for ensuring dignity. Jonathan often said during his talks, "It only takes one spark to reveal the darkness. The question is, will you be the spark when it's your moment?" The families affected by Kane's corruption were finally finding closure. Many saw their cases reopened and resolved fairly. Some received compensation for the damage done, while others simply felt relief that their names were cleared. One evening, Anthony visited a family whose wrongful eviction case had been reinstated. The father, holding his small daughter, said softly, "We got our home back because you stood up. You didn't know us, but you fought for us anyway." Anthony smiled gently. "You deserved justice. That's all that matters." Meanwhile, Kane's trial and conviction had become a national cautionary tale. Law enforcement academies used his story to teach recruits about the consequences of unchecked bias. His name was etched into legal history, not as a hero, but as a warning of what power without accountability can destroy. In prison, Kane sat silently day after day, realizing the legacy he left behind was one of disgrace. While the man he once tried to humiliate had become a force for lasting change. Later that year, the city held a youth leadership summit at the Justice Hub. Hundreds of students attended, eager to learn about civic duty and integrity. Anthony was there, but he didn't speak on stage this time. He sat quietly in the audience, watching Deshawn, now a seasoned attorney, address the next generation. "We stand on the shoulders of those who chose courage over silence," Deshawn told the students. "What happened in this courthouse showed us that one person can challenge a system and a community can rebuild it stronger. Now, it's our turn to carry that forward." The crowd applauded, and Anthony felt a quiet pride as he saw how far the movement had come. After the event, Elaine joined him outside the plaza where the monument stood bathed in golden light. Children were placing flowers at its base, reading the inscription, "Justice belongs to the people. Courage keeps it alive." Elaine leaned her head on Anthony's shoulder. "It's no longer just your story," she whispered. Anthony smiled softly. "It never was just mine. It belongs to all of them now." Because the truth they fought for had grown beyond one man's moment. It had become a legacy carried by an entire generation. As the years passed, the changes born from the courthouse scandal became deeply rooted in the state's justice system. What had once been considered extraordinary reforms were now standard practice in every courthouse. Oversight committees, transparent case management, and community involvement were no longer optional. They were expected. Anthony Reed found himself stepping back more and more, allowing the younger generation to take the lead. Deshawn, once a law student inspired by Anthony's courage, was now a powerful advocate in his own right, working on federal-level initiatives to improve judicial ethics nationwide. At a large civic conference, Deshawn stood on stage, speaking to thousands of attendees. "We owe our progress to those who stood firm when it wasn't easy." Anthony Reed showed us that quiet courage can reveal the cracks in a system and push us to rebuild it stronger. Now, it's our responsibility to keep that momentum alive, not just here, but everywhere justice is needed. The audience gave a standing ovation, many turning to glance at Anthony, who was sitting quietly in the front row. He gave Deshawn a small nod of approval, his heart full of pride. Meanwhile, Linda Vasquez had become a national ethics advisor, consulting with other states on implementing the same reforms she spearheaded. She was often asked how such a massive overhaul had started. "It started with one man refusing to be silent," she would say simply. "That's all it takes to expose the truth." Back in the city, the Safe Justice Project had grown beyond courthouses. It now worked with schools, businesses, and public institutions to ensure dignity was the foundation of every interaction. Jonathan Hayes, semi-retired, occasionally returned for key events. During one such event, Jonathan spoke to a crowd of young volunteers. "Don't wait for someone else to step up. Integrity isn't about waiting for the perfect moment. It's about choosing the right moment, even if it costs you." That's what Anthony did, and look what it created. The community, once fractured by fear and mistrust, now thrived. The reopened cases had brought long-awaited closure to families. Businesses partnered with the Justice Hub to fund scholarships, ensuring more young people could pursue careers in law and advocacy. One afternoon, Anthony visited the courthouse. He walked through the main lobby, now bright and welcoming, and stopped in front of the monument. Children on a school tour stood nearby, listening as a guide explained the story behind it. "This monument honors the people who made our courthouse fair and safe, the guide said. It reminds us that justice belongs to everyone. Anthony listened quietly, a faint smile on his face. Meanwhile, Kane remained in prison. His name had become a footnote in training materials for law enforcement and legal ethics courses. Occasionally, documentaries revisited his case, but always as a cautionary tale. He watched his legacy reduced to a lesson in what not to become, while the man he once tried to humiliate had become a symbol of hope. Later that evening, Anthony and Elaine attended a Youth Leadership Awards ceremony at the Justice Hub. The winners, students who had led community reform projects, stood proudly on stage. One of them, a young woman named Maya, spoke into the microphone. "I'm standing here because someone showed us that the law can serve the people if we demand it. Because of his courage, I believe in justice again." She looked toward Anthony with gratitude shining in her eyes. After the ceremony, Elaine leaned close to him and whispered, "They're ready now. They don't need us to guide them anymore." Anthony nodded, feeling a calm peace settle over him. That was the goal all along, for them to take it further than we ever could. As they left the plaza, they passed the glowing mural one more time. It had grown over the years, now depicting generations of advocates holding a single torch of justice together. Beneath it were the words, "Courage begins with one, but lives on through many." Anthony paused, taking it in one last time. Because the truth he stood for had outgrown him completely, becoming a legacy carried by countless hands, ensuring justice would never again be silenced. Years later, the reform sparked by the courthouse scandal had expanded far beyond the state. What began as a local reckoning became a national standard for accountability in public institutions. Courthouses across the country now operated under strict transparency laws, with oversight committees and public reporting requirements. At a National Justice Summit in Washington, D.C., leaders from multiple states gathered to celebrate the success of these initiatives. Deshawn, now a nationally recognized attorney, stood on the main stage, addressing an audience of lawmakers, judges, and community leaders. "We are living proof that one act of courage can ripple into lasting change," he said. Anthony Reed showed us that refusing to accept injustice, even in a small moment, can ignite a movement that reshapes the entire system. The room erupted in applause. Sitting quietly in the front row, Anthony exchanged a small smile with Elaine. He had never sought recognition, but hearing how far the message had traveled gave him a quiet sense of peace. Meanwhile, Linda Vasquez was now advising federal agencies on judicial ethics. She had been nominated for a national award honoring her work on the Kane investigation. At the ceremony, she reflected on the journey. "It wasn't me who made this happen," Linda said. "It was the man who stood silently but firmly in the face of intimidation. It was the community who demanded better. I was just the one who followed where their courage led." Back in their home city, the Safe Justice Project had grown into an international movement. Countries around the world reached out to adopt its model, creating transparent systems of accountability. Jonathan Hayes, though fully retired, received letters from overseas leaders thanking him for planting the seed. "I didn't change the world," Jonathan often said when asked about it. "I just did the right thing in a single moment." The rest happened because people refused to let that moment fade. In the city, life flourished. The reopened cases had brought justice to families who once thought hope was gone. Small businesses that had been unfairly shut down were compensated. Names cleared by the new investigations were honored at community gatherings. The courthouse plaza became a symbol of resilience, visited by people from across the country. One sunny afternoon, Anthony and Elaine visited the plaza to meet Maya, the young woman they'd seen speak at the Leadership Awards years before. Now, a practicing attorney, she had taken over the youth mentorship program at the Justice Hub. "I wanted you to see what you've built," Maya told them, showing them a bustling room filled with young students learning about civic duty. "These kids don't know fear in the courthouse like past generations did. They only know what it's supposed to feel like, safe and fair, because of you." Elaine smiled, touched. "It's because of all of you. You took it further than we could have ever imagined." Meanwhile, Kane's name faded further into obscurity. In prison, he was just another inmate with a disgraced past. His story lived on only in law textbooks and ethics courses, a permanent reminder of how unchecked power destroys itself. Later that evening, Anthony and Elaine walked through the courthouse plaza one more time. The mural had been expanded again, now spanning the entire block with new faces, young advocates, families, community leaders, all holding the same torch of justice. At the center were the words, "What begins as one voice becomes the strength of many." Elaine rested her head gently on Anthony's shoulder. "It's their story now," she said softly. Anthony nodded, his voice calm. "And that's exactly how it should be." Because the truth he stood for had become a movement carried by countless others, ensuring that justice would never again be silenced. And somewhere, far removed from the light of progress, Kane remained forgotten, a cautionary tale swallowed by the legacy of what replaced him. Because when truth is shared, it doesn't just survive, it grows beyond anyone's reach. Years rolled forward, and the reforms that began in a single courthouse were now embedded into the fabric of the nation's justice system. New generations grew up, never knowing the fear or mistrust that once haunted those courthouse halls. They only knew transparency, respect, and accountability as the norm. Anthony and Elaine now lived a quieter life. Their days were filled with simple joys: gardening, visiting the local library, and watching the neighborhood children play. Yet, their story continued to echo in places far beyond their quiet street. In Washington, D.C., the National Institute for Judicial Integrity hosted its annual summit. Maya, the young attorney they had once mentored, now stood at the podium as a keynote speaker. "When I was just a student, I learned about Anthony Reed," Maya said to the packed auditorium of judges, lawyers, and advocates. "He didn't shout. He didn't fight with rage. He stood calmly in the face of injustice and refused to back down. That moment showed us what real courage looks like. It's the reason he and so many of you chose this path." The crowd gave a standing ovation. Sitting in the audience, Deshawn smiled proudly, knowing the torch had truly been passed to the next generation. Meanwhile, Linda Vasquez, now serving as a federal advisor for ethics reform, continued her mission quietly but powerfully. At a press conference, she credited Anthony once again. Systems don't change because of titles. They change because of people who refuse to accept what's wrong. Anthony Reed was one of those people. And because of him, thousands have been given justice they never thought they'd see. Across the ocean, the Safe Justice Project reached international recognition. Countries in Europe, Africa, and Asia began adopting its principles to rebuild trust in their legal systems. Jonathan Hayes, retired but still deeply respected, sent Anthony a handwritten note. What started with a single act in a courthouse now spans the world. You may have thought it was small, but it was never small. It was the spark we all needed. Back in the city, the Justice and Advocacy Hub had transformed into a vibrant complex. Inside, new programs were running to educate youth about ethics, law, and civic duty. Anthony and Elaine visited occasionally, but they stayed in the background, letting the young leaders run the show. During one visit, a group of children were touring the hub. They stopped in front of a framed photograph of Anthony, taken the day he gave his first public speech after Kane's suspension. The guide explained, "This is Anthony Reed. Because he stood his ground, the courthouse you walk into today is safe, fair, and just." He reminded us that one person can change everything. Anthony quietly watched from a distance. Elaine touched his arm gently, her eyes misty. "They're teaching it like history now," she whispered. Anthony gave a small smile. "That's because it is history. It's no longer ours. It belongs to everyone." Meanwhile, Kane's name was now nothing more than a cautionary tale in textbooks, a story told in law enforcement academies about the cost of corruption. In prison, he had become a forgotten figure, overshadowed entirely by the reforms his downfall had sparked. That evening, Anthony and Elaine walked through the courthouse plaza one last time. The mural had been completed with the final touches. New faces of young advocates, judges, and community leaders holding hands around a torch of justice. Beneath it were the final words, "One moment of truth can light a path for generations." Elaine rested her head on Anthony's shoulder, her voice soft but full of peace. "It feels like it's complete now." Anthony nodded, gazing at the glowing mural. "It's more than complete. It's alive, and it'll keep living long after us." Because the truth they stood for had become timeless, carried forward by voices they had never met, ensuring that justice would never again be silenced. And somewhere, far away, Kane remained in his cell, an echo of a past erased by the light of reform. Because when courage becomes a legacy, it outlasts even the darkest shadows. As more years passed, the reforms born from the courthouse scandal became not just a national model, but a global benchmark. Countries from around the world sent delegations to study the Safe Justice Project, implementing its principles in their own systems. What started as one man's stand against injustice now shaped policies continents away. Maya, now a well-known international advocate, traveled abroad frequently, teaching civic leaders how to create transparent and fair judicial practices. During a global ethics summit, she addressed an audience of officials from 30 countries. "This movement began with a single moment in a courthouse," she said. "Anthony Reed didn't plan to change the system. He simply refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. That choice echoed far beyond what he imagined, and now it belongs to all of us." The audience rose in applause, proving the impact of that one act had indeed crossed borders. Meanwhile, Deshawn had taken a senior role in national policy, working with lawmakers to expand judicial reforms even further. He was often asked about his motivation. "It was Anthony," he would reply without hesitation. "He showed me that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. His calm courage became my blueprint." Back in their hometown, the Justice and Advocacy Hub had grown into a campus of civic education, complete with libraries, training centers, and youth mentorship programs. Every week, groups of students visited to learn about ethics and leadership, walking past murals and plaques that told the story of how their city became a beacon of hope. Anthony and Elaine visited less often now, but whenever they did, they were welcomed warmly. One afternoon, they arrived quietly and watched a group of young students gathered around the monument outside. The guide explained to the children, "This is where it all started. Anthony Reed faced an officer who abused his power, but he stayed calm. Because of that, the truth came out, and everything changed. Always remember, you have that power too." Anthony stood at a distance, hearing his story retold by someone he had never met. He glanced at Elaine, who smiled softly. "It's like watching history take on a life of its own," she whispered. He nodded. "And that's exactly how it should be." Meanwhile, Kane's existence in prison had faded into obscurity. He was no longer a headline or even a point of anger, just a forgotten cautionary tale. His actions were studied only as a lesson in what unchecked bias could do. The world had rebuilt itself without him, and in doing so, erased any power he once held. Later that evening, Anthony and Elaine attended a global justice gala via live broadcast from their home. They watched as young leaders from across the world were honored for their work in judicial reform. The host closed the event with a statement that struck Anthony deeply. "We owe this movement to one man's refusal to back down in a moment of injustice. His courage lit a flame that has now spread across the world. Today, we honor Anthony Reed, not just for what he did, but for what he inspired in all of us." Elaine turned to Anthony with quiet pride. "They'll never forget," she said softly. Anthony smiled faintly, his voice calm. "They shouldn't. Not because of me, but because of what it means. That justice can always be reclaimed." The next morning, they walked through the courthouse plaza one more time. The mural was more breathtaking than ever, now surrounded by new sculptures representing unity and resilience. Beneath it, a new inscription had been added. "One moment of courage can change the course of history." Elaine slipped her arm through his. "It feels like we can finally rest, knowing the future is in good hands." Anthony nodded, looking at the faces of the children playing near the monument. "It's theirs now, and it will always belong to them, because the truth he once stood for had outgrown him entirely, becoming a living legacy of justice carried by the next generation." And miles away, Kane remained a silent shadow of the past, forgotten, while the light of reform burned brighter than ever. Because when courage is shared, it doesn't end, it multiplies. Years later, Anthony and Elaine found themselves stepping further into the background as the next generation fully embraced leadership. The once small movement that grew from a single moment of injustice was now a global standard for judicial integrity. Nations across the world recognized the Safe Justice Project, adapting its methods to create transparency and trust within their own systems. Deshawn, now a senior policy advisor and widely respected attorney, spearheaded international collaborations. At a global forum in Geneva, he addressed a crowd of leaders, lawyers, and advocates from over 50 countries. We're here because one man showed us that dignity doesn't need to shout. It simply refuses to move, Deshawn said. Anthony Reed proved that even in silence, courage can dismantle corruption. It's up to us to carry that courage everywhere. The audience gave him a standing ovation, many holding small candles as a symbol of the light Anthony's act had sparked. Meanwhile, Maya, now an internationally recognized human rights lawyer, led the expansion of the justice hubs into underprivileged regions across the world. Her team built programs that taught children and communities about their legal rights. In one interview, she smiled and said, "I'm just continuing the work Anthony and Elaine began." They showed us that even the simplest act of standing firm can grow into something far beyond what you imagine. Back in their quiet hometown, Anthony and Elaine lived peacefully. They rarely appeared at events anymore, but every so often they received heartfelt letters. One came from a small village overseas where a new justice hub had opened. "Because of your courage, our community now has a voice. We are safer and we believe in justice again. Thank you for lighting the way." Elaine read the letter aloud, tears softening her eyes. "Can you believe this started in a single courthouse hallway?" Anthony smiled gently. "It proves that no act of truth is ever too small." Meanwhile, Kane's name had faded entirely from public memory. He remained in prison, just another forgotten inmate. Law textbooks referred to him only briefly, labeling him as an example of power unchecked, while the story focused instead on the reforms that followed. His legacy was no longer his own. It was the change he inadvertently ignited, a change that erased everything he tried to control. In the city, the courthouse plaza had become a place of pilgrimage for people wanting to honor the movement. On the anniversary of the reforms, hundreds gathered there, lighting candles around the monument. Children from local schools recited the inscription, "One voice can reveal the truth. Many voices can protect it forever." During one such gathering, Deshawn spoke to the crowd. "Anthony and Elaine aren't here today because they've given this movement to us. It's ours to carry forward now. We are proof that their courage was not in vain. It lives in all of us." The crowd applauded, and young children placed flowers at the foot of the monument. That evening, Anthony and Elaine watched the event live on television from their living room. Elaine leaned her head on his shoulder and smiled softly. "They're doing it without us now." Anthony nodded, his voice calm and peaceful. "That's how it should be. It was never about us. It was about what would come after us." The next day, they took one last quiet walk through the courthouse plaza. The mural had grown even larger, now depicting faces from all over the world, diverse communities united by a single idea. Justice belongs to everyone. Beneath it, new words had been added. Courage doesn't end. It travels through generations. Elaine took Anthony's hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's eternal now." Anthony smiled faintly. "Yes, and it always will be." Because the truth they stood for had become more than a story. It had become a movement woven into the lives of countless people, ensuring that dignity and justice would never again be silenced. And far away, Kane sat alone in his cell, erased by the very change his actions had unleashed. Because when courage is shared, it becomes infinite. As the years passed, the movement that began in a single courthouse became woven into global history. Justice hubs existed in hundreds of cities around the world, each one shaped by the principles that Anthony Reed's quiet defiance had inspired. Young leaders, people who hadn't even been born when Kane's corruption was exposed, now ran programs, wrote policies, and trained others in the values of fairness and integrity. Deshaun had become an internationally recognized figure, advising governments on reform. At a massive summit in Brussels, he addressed thousands of people, his voice steady and confident. "Courage doesn't always roar," he said. "Sometimes it's just standing firm in a single moment." Anthony Reed stood in a courthouse hallway and chose not to move. That choice reshaped not just a system, but generations of lives. That's why we're here today, because one man believed in the truth. The audience rose in applause, holding candles to symbolize the spark of courage that had traveled across the world. Meanwhile, Maya, now a leading human rights advocate, unveiled new justice hubs in underserved regions of South America and Africa. In an interview, she smiled gently. "Anthony and Elaine didn't just show us how to fight corruption. They showed us how to build trust. This isn't about one city anymore. It's about ensuring dignity everywhere." Back in their peaceful hometown, Anthony and Elaine lived quietly. Their days were filled with serene routines, tending their small garden, reading books, and occasionally receiving visits from young advocates who wanted to thank them in person. One afternoon, they received a package from overseas. Inside was a photo of a brand new courthouse in Kenya, adorned with a plaque in multiple languages that read, "Inspired by the courage of Anthony Reed, justice belongs to all." Elaine held the photo, tears softening her eyes. "It's unbelievable, Anthony. This went further than either of us could have imagined." Anthony smiled faintly. "It shows that truth doesn't have borders." Meanwhile, Kane's name had been erased from memory, except as a footnote in ethics courses. Law academies taught his story as a lesson in the dangers of unchecked authority, while the focus always remained on the change that followed. In his cell, he was just another forgotten man, living in the shadow of the justice he tried to undermine. In the city, the courthouse plaza became a place of annual gathering. On the anniversary of the reforms, people filled the square, lighting candles around the monument. Children recited the words engraved on it. "One moment of courage can echo forever." At one such ceremony, Maya spoke to the crowd. "Anthony and Elaine no longer lead this movement. They gifted it to us. It's ours now, and it's our duty to ensure that courage never fades." The crowd erupted in applause, while live streams broadcast the event to viewers around the globe. Anthony and Elaine watched the ceremony from home, sitting together on their porch. Elaine leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "They've made it their own now. They don't need us anymore." Anthony nodded with a calm smile. That was always the goal, to make sure it would outlive us. The next day, they took a quiet stroll through the courthouse plaza. The mural was now complete, stretching across multiple walls, depicting faces of people from all nations united by justice. At the very center was a single torch, surrounded by countless hands reaching upward. Beneath it were new words in dozens of languages. "Courage starts with one, but belongs to everyone." Elaine stopped to take it in, her voice soft. It's beautiful. It's like the whole world is a part of it now. Anthony smiled gently, his eyes reflecting the mural's glow. It is, and it will always be. Because the truth they once stood for had become timeless, no longer tied to a single courthouse or a single man, but carried by millions who believed in it. And miles away, Kane remained in silence, erased from relevance by the very change he could never stop. Because when truth becomes a legacy, it spreads endlessly, beyond walls, borders, and generations. Over time, the legacy of Anthony Reed and the courthouse reforms became permanently etched into history. School curriculums began teaching the story as a pivotal moment in modern justice reform. In textbooks around the world, the narrative was clear. One man's quiet stand against injustice sparked a chain of accountability that reshaped systems globally. At a university lecture, a professor pointed to a slide showing the mural at the courthouse plaza. This, she told her students, is not just art. It's a reminder that courage doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be consistent. Anthony Reed faced a corrupt officer and stood firm. That single act gave birth to the safe justice movement you all know today. Students scribbled notes, inspired by the simple yet powerful message. Meanwhile, Deshaun had become a key figure in drafting international judicial ethics agreements. At a conference at the United Nations, he addressed leaders from dozens of countries. When we talk about justice, we're really talking about trust, he said. Anthony Reed restored that trust by refusing to move when faced with intimidation. That act of resilience became the seed for the reforms we're discussing today. The delegates applauded, and many nations pledged to adopt similar systems. Maya, now leading a global network of justice hubs, sent regular updates to Anthony and Elaine. One day, a letter arrived from her office in South America. Inside were photographs of smiling children holding certificates from a new program that taught them about their legal rights. Because of you, entire generations are growing up knowing dignity is their birthright. Thank you for showing us what one moment can do, the letter read. Elaine held the photos in her hands, her voice soft with wonder. It's unbelievable. It's like the whole world is carrying this now. Anthony nodded, a quiet pride in his eyes. That's what makes it last. It's theirs now, not ours. Back in their city, the courthouse plaza had become a historical site. Tourists visited from around the world, walking through exhibits that detailed the events that led to the reforms. Children took field trips there, learning about how a single moment of truth can outshine years of corruption. A young guide pointed to the monument and told the students, "This is where a man stood firm against injustice." And from that, everything changed. Always remember, you have the power to do the same. Meanwhile, Kane's name had been relegated to a mere footnote in history books. His actions were taught only as a warning of what happens when power is abused without accountability. In prison, he lived in obscurity, his story eclipsed entirely by the positive change he unintentionally ignited. One evening, Anthony and Elaine were invited to a quiet dinner with Deshaun and Maya. Over a simple meal, they listened as the younger leaders shared their plans to expand reforms into even more countries. We want to take the safe justice model to communities that still struggle with corruption, Maya said. We're building teams across Africa and Asia now. This is just the beginning. Anthony smiled softly. You don't need my guidance anymore. You're already doing more than I ever could. Deshaun shook his head. We're only here because you gave us the example. We're just carrying the torch you lit. Later that night, Anthony and Elaine took a final stroll through the courthouse plaza. The mural glowed under the soft lights, now surrounded by interactive panels that told the story in multiple languages. Families walked quietly, reading about how justice was reclaimed. Beneath the mural, a new inscription had been added. One moment can reveal the truth. Many moments can change the world. Elaine rested her head on Anthony's shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. It's complete now. They've taken it further than we ever dreamed. Anthony nodded, feeling a calm peace settle over him. And they'll keep taking it further. That's how legacies live. Because the truth they once carried was no longer a moment in time. It was now part of humanity's shared history, passed on to every hand willing to hold it. And far away, Kane sat forgotten, his name erased by the light of a movement that could never be stopped. Because when truth becomes a legacy, it grows beyond time, beyond borders, beyond any single person. As the years continued to unfold, the movement had become an unshakable part of global justice. The Safe Justice Project operated on nearly every continent, providing oversight tools and ethical training for courts, schools, and public institutions. What once began in a single courthouse hallway was now shaping the future for millions. In cities around the world, children learned about Anthony Reed's stand in their civic classes. His story wasn't told as a tale of victimhood, but as a lesson in quiet power, a reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to move. At an international youth summit in Tokyo, Maya stood before thousands of young leaders. We are the generation that carries the torch forward, she told them. Anthony Reed showed us that one moment of integrity can outlive corruption. It can become a light so strong that no darkness can erase it. You are the keepers of that light now. The crowd erupted in applause, many holding small lights in their hands, symbolizing the courage that had traveled from one man to the entire world. Meanwhile, Deshaun was now working with the United Nations on a global justice compact, a collaborative agreement to ensure transparency and dignity in legal systems worldwide. When asked in an interview what drove his relentless work, he smiled faintly. It's simple, he said. I saw a man who chose dignity over silence, and I promised myself I'd never forget that lesson. Back in their quiet hometown, Anthony and Elaine lived peacefully, far from the cameras and conferences. They spent their days reading, tending their garden, and occasionally opening letters from people they'd never met. One day, a package arrived from a small village in India. Inside was a hand-carved plaque that read, "Because of your courage, we built a justice center for our community. You reminded us that the truth belongs to everyone." Elaine held it carefully, her eyes filling with quiet tears. "Anthony," she whispered, "look how far it's gone." Anthony smiled gently. Truth travels farther than any of us ever could. Meanwhile, the courthouse in their city had become a place of learning and reflection. Visitors from around the world toured the plaza, reading the history engraved into the walls. Teachers brought students to see the mural and the monument, reminding them that justice is a living promise, not just a word. The annual Justice Day celebration in the city had grown massive, drawing crowds from across the country. On the latest anniversary, Deshawn returned to speak at the plaza. "We don't gather here to remember injustice," he told the crowd. "We gather here to honor the courage that stopped it." Anthony Reed gave us an example that belongs to all of us now. This legacy isn't his alone. It's ours. The audience cheered, candles lighting up the night sky. From their living room, Anthony and Elaine watched the ceremony on television. Elaine leaned her head on his shoulder. "They don't just remember, they keep it alive." Anthony nodded quietly. "And they'll keep it alive long after we're gone." That's how you know it's bigger than one person. In a distant prison, Kane's name had long since faded into irrelevance. He was no longer even mentioned in the news, just another inmate serving time for choices that now felt meaningless. His story existed only in ethics textbooks, as a warning of what power without integrity becomes. The next morning, Anthony and Elaine took one more stroll through the courthouse plaza. The mural had been updated again, this time featuring images of people from every continent holding hands, united around a glowing torch. Beneath it was a new inscription in multiple languages. "Truth is the seed, justice is the garden, courage is the water that keeps it alive." Elaine smiled softly. "It feels like the whole world is part of this now." Anthony looked at the faces painted on the wall, each one a reflection of the lives touched by the movement. "It is, and it always will be." Because what began as one moment in a courthouse had become a legacy that no darkness could ever erase. Years later, Anthony and Elaine had completely stepped away from public life. The movement that had grown from a single moment was now self-sustaining, led by an entire generation of advocates who had taken the mission further than anyone could have imagined. What started in one courthouse had become a global standard for justice and dignity. On the 20th anniversary of the reforms, cities around the world held ceremonies honoring the legacy. In every justice hub, murals depicted the same torch of truth being passed from one hand to another. School children recited the story of how one man's calm refusal to accept injustice changed the course of history. In their quiet living room, Anthony and Elaine watched the international broadcast. Leaders from across the globe spoke about how the Safe Justice Project had reshaped systems, while young voices shared how the story inspired them to pursue law and community work. Maya, now a renowned global human rights lawyer, addressed the crowd at the main ceremony in New York City. "Anthony Reed showed us that courage doesn't have to be loud. It has to be steady," she said. "Because of him, millions now believe that justice can truly belong to everyone. Today we honor not just the man, but the movement he inspired." The crowd erupted in applause, holding up candles that filled the night with a sea of light. Back in their hometown, the courthouse plaza had become a landmark. Visitors from all over the world came to see the mural, the monument, and the exhibit that told the story in multiple languages. The mural now stretched across several walls, featuring faces of people from all continents, united around a single glowing torch of justice. Anthony and Elaine decided to visit the plaza one last time. As they walked hand in hand through the crowd of visitors, they paused in front of the newest inscription. From one act of courage grew a movement that changed the world. Children on a school trip gathered around the monument, listening as a guide told the story. "This is Anthony Reed," the guide said, pointing to a bronze plaque with Anthony's likeness. "He faced a corrupt officer who thought power could silence the truth. But he stood calmly, and because he stood, the truth spread further than he ever imagined. Anthony watched quietly from the back, his heart full. Elaine squeezed his hand gently. They're teaching it like history now. It doesn't even feel like it's about us anymore. Anthony smiled faintly. That's because it isn't. It's about everyone who believed in what came after. Meanwhile, Deshaun and Maya had fully taken the mantle of leadership. They traveled internationally, working with communities still fighting corruption, expanding the reach of the movement. Each time they spoke, they made sure to honor the moment that started it all. And far away, in a forgotten corner of a prison, Kane's name was all but erased. He was no longer mentioned in ceremonies or discussions except as a small cautionary note, a reminder of what unchecked arrogance can cost. That evening, Anthony and Elaine returned home to their quiet neighborhood. They sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft gold. Elaine rested her head on his shoulder. "It's done, isn't it?" she asked softly. Anthony nodded, his voice calm and peaceful. "It's not just done. It's alive. It doesn't need us anymore. And that's how we know it will last." As the sun dipped below the horizon, they felt the gentle peace of knowing they had done their part. The movement was no longer theirs to hold. It belonged to the world. Because the truth they once carried had grown into something timeless, beyond borders, beyond generations, beyond even their names. And somewhere, in the silence of a forgotten prison cell, Kane sat, with the reality that his legacy had been erased, replaced entirely by a light he could never extinguish. Because when courage becomes a legacy, it outlives the darkness forever.